welcome to the deep dive. You guys know the Menendez brothers case, right? It's like True Crime 101.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those cases that just sticks with you.
Totally. And judging by the mountain of articles, court transcripts, even some pop culture stuff you sent us, you guys are way past the surface level on this one.
We're not kidding. Looks like we've got some serious deep divers in the audience.
Right. So we're going to go deep, too. Evidence, psychology, all the lingering questions. We're tackling it all.
Absolutely. It's a case that keeps people talking even decades later for a reason. There's just so much to unpack.
Exactly. And what really struck me, going through everything you sent, yeah, everyone knows about the spending spree after they inherited all that money.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic part of the story.
What do they actually buy? And, what does that tell us?
That's where things get really interesting. Like, one of the first things Lyle buys is a Rolex, right? Worth over $9,000.
Whoa.
I mean, that's a pretty big splurge for anyone, let alone someone who supposedly just lost both their parents.
Okay, true. But maybe he just had expensive taste. Like, sometimes people buy themselves something nice after a loss, a way to cope, you know?
Yeah, I get that. But a lot of experts who study grief and trauma say that kind of extravagant spending, especially so soon after a loss, it can be a sign of denial.
Denial.
Yeah, or even like a subconscious way to distance yourself from what happened, from the pain.
Huh. So, Lyle buying that Rolex, could that actually be evidence against him being all broken up about his parents?
Potentially, yeah. And it wasn't just Lyle either.
Oh, right. Eric went on a spending spree, too.
Oh, yeah. Like, Eric hired this personal tennis coach, $10,000 a month, plus tons of clothes, travel, the whole 9 yards.
Living the high life.
Exactly. And that really clashes with the image of two devastated, heartbroken sons, right?
Right, yeah. That's a tough image to sell when you're dropping cash like that.
Right. And the prosecution, they really hammered on that during the trial.
I bet. Because it's not just about being greedy, it's about their actions not matching their story.
Exactly. And it definitely had an impact. The public saw these two guys seemingly enjoying their newfound wealth, and it just didn't add up with the whole abuse victims thing the defense was trying to push.
Okay, so the spending spree definitely raises a ton of questions. But let's rewind a bit. August 20th, 1989, Beverly Hills, California. That's where this crazy story starts, right?
Yep, right in one of those classic Beverly Hills mansions. Huge, sprawling, you know the type.
Oh, yeah, picture perfect.
But inside, not so picture perfect. Jose and Kitty Menendez, the brothers' parents, found dead in their living room.
And the details, even just from the news reports back then, were brutal.
Oh, absolutely. Jose was shot 6 times, including once point blank in the back of the head. Kitty was shot 10 times, some of those shots after she was already down.
Jeez. That level of violence, especially in a supposedly safe, quiet neighborhood like Beverly Hills, that's got to be shocking.
Totally. And because of that, initially, nobody suspected the sons at all.
Right, you sent us a copy of Eric's 911 call, and I remember hearing it on the news all those years ago.
It's chilling.
He sounds genuinely panicked, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
That 911 call, it was a key piece of evidence early on. Eric's voice is shaky, he's crying, he tells the operator, and I quote, "Someone killed my parents."
Wow.
It's raw, it's emotional, you can't really fake that kind of distress, you know?
So everyone felt for them. 2 young guys, seemingly good family, suddenly orphaned in this horrific attack.
Yeah, the picture of innocence.
But we know that didn't last very long, did it?
Nope. And that shift, it lines up perfectly with all that questionable spending we were talking about earlier. The grieving sons started looking more and more like, well, opportunistic heirs.
Right, right. So we've got this brutal crime scene, grieving sons suddenly living it up, and the public starting to doubt their story.
Yeah.
What happens next? Does the investigation kick into overdrive?
It does, and that's when things get even darker, because the brothers, instead of laying low, they start hinting at a motive. And it wasn't greed. It was something way more complicated. Self-defense.
Whoa, wait, self-defense? Against their own parents? How did that even come up? Self-defense, that's a huge jump. What did they actually say happened?
Well, this is where things get really, really messy, because the brothers, they start talking about years of abuse from their dad, Jose. Physical, sexual, the whole thing.
Hold on, abuse. I remember this being a big deal in the news, but wasn't that just dismissed as a way to, get out of jail?
That's exactly how the prosecution spun it. They said Jose was a strict dad, sure, but loving. And Kitty, she had her own problems, but loved her sons.
Okay, but the brothers insisted this abuse was real.
Absolutely. Both Lyle and Eric, they testified, describing these awful incidents, beatings, threats, and with Eric especially, some really disturbing accounts of sexual abuse. They claim they lived in constant fear of Jose, of his temper, and that killing him was like the only way to escape.
Wow, that must have been intense in the courtroom.
Oh, it was. But the prosecution, of course, jumped on the fact that there were no other witnesses to this abuse.
Right, so how did the defense counter that?
They brought in expert witnesses, specialists in child psychology and abuse. Their argument was that the brothers' actions, even the spending spree, the weird inconsistencies in their stories, that it could all be linked back to trauma.
So not directly proving abuse happened, but saying their actions fit the pattern of someone who'd been abused.
Exactly. And this was the early 90s, remember? People didn't talk about abuse like they do now. But the defense, they argued that abuse victims, they don't react in predictable ways.
Right.
Some withdraw, some lash out, and some, like maybe the brothers, use spending to like feel in control or numb themselves.
So even the stuff that seemed incriminating, they tied back to the alleged abuse.
Yep. And that's where those specific purchases you asked about earlier, they become even more interesting.
Okay, how so?
Well, take that Rolex Lyle bought. The defense said it wasn't just about showing off. It was about him trying to grab a symbol of power, masculinity, something he never had with his dad.
Yeah, that's a whole different way of looking at it.
Right. Not just a spoiled rich kid, but maybe a victim trying to heal these deep psychological wounds.
Wow, that's heavy.
And with Eric and the tennis coach, it was similar. The defense said he wasn't just splurging, he was searching for a good male role model, someone he could trust, which he never had with Jose.
So both of them, it was about a deeper need, not just greed.
Exactly. And look, this argument, it was controversial for sure, but some people bought it. The brothers' testimonies, they were emotional, and combined with the experts talking about abuse, it made the case way more complicated than just spoiled kids kill for money.
It really makes you think about how we judge people's actions, especially when trauma might be involved. It's not always so black and white. But even with all that, the brothers were still convicted, right?
They were. Which brings us to the prosecution side, their big evidence, and how they managed to convince the jury.
All right, lay it on me. What did they have that was so strong it beat all that?
Well, they focused on a few key things. One was the lack of physical evidence to back up the abuse claims. No medical records, no photos of injuries, nothing solid.
But couldn't the defense argue that abuse isn't always visible? Like emotional abuse?
They did. But the prosecution, they countered by pointing out all the inconsistencies in the brothers' stories about the abuse. The timelines didn't quite match up, the details were fuzzy, and there were times it felt like they were exaggerating things.
Yeah, inconsistencies like that, they can really hurt your credibility with the jury.
Absolutely. And then there was the shotgun, the one Lyle bought just days before the murders.
Oof, yeah, I forgot about that.
The prosecution said that's premeditation right there. He planned to kill his parents, and he got the weapon to do it.
That's pretty hard to explain away.
The defense tried. They said Lyle bought the shotgun for protection, that he was genuinely scared of Jose and his violent temper, the threats he'd made. The shotgun was just to feel safe.
But wouldn't that go against their self-defense claim for the actual killings? If they were that terrified, wouldn't they have just avoided Jose altogether?
Good point. And the prosecution made that exact argument. If they were really scared of Jose, why be in the same house as him, let alone with a loaded shotgun?
Yeah, that doesn't track.
Right. So it seems like the prosecution, they found enough holes in the defense's story to create that doubt, that reasonable doubt.
Not to get a conviction.
Yep. Their whole argument boiled down to greed and entitlement. The brothers had it all, but they were still unhappy with how much their parents controlled their lives, their money. The murders, according to the prosecution, they were a cold, calculated move to get freedom and a fortune.
And the jury bought it. But even with a guilty verdict, this case still gets people fired up, right? There are still people who believe the brothers were victims, pushed too far.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this case so fascinating, so enduring. It goes way beyond just the crime itself. It's about psychology, how society views abuse, and the crazy dynamics of families.
There's something about these cases that makes us want to believe there's got to be more to the story, especially when it's something this horrific.
I get it. And with this case, the story definitely goes beyond the courtroom. The Menendez brothers, their case really changed how we talk about abuse, especially in rich families where it's often hidden.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about that impact for a minute. You said this was the early 90s, a time when people thought about abuse differently.
Totally different. Back then, the idea of a dad sexually abusing his sons, that was taboo. Nobody talked about it. And if you did, people didn't believe you.
So the brothers, whether they were guilty or not, They kind of force society to deal with this uncomfortable truth about abuse, even in seemingly perfect families.
Exactly. Their case, along with some others around the same time, it raised awareness about child abuse, about the scars trauma leaves, and the fact that we need better ways to support victims.
That's a pretty significant legacy, even if it was unintentional.
For sure, it shows how even a tragic case like this can spark positive change. More awareness, better understanding, and maybe a less judgmental approach to these issues of abuse and family.
That's a good point. But before we wrap up this part, I got to ask, this case was a media circus, right? I remember seeing it everywhere back then. Did that affect the case at all, how people saw the brothers?
Oh, absolutely. We can't ignore that part. The Menendez case, it was one of the first to be so heavily televised. Cameras in the courtroom, every little moment broadcasted.
Wow, reality TV before reality TV was really a thing.
Right. It became this spectacle, this real life soap opera that everyone was hooked on, which, can be dangerous.
Oh yeah, definitely. That kind of coverage, it can totally sway public opinion, even jurors.
No doubt. Constant media attention, dramatic reenactments, endless speculation. It all creates this pressure cooker atmosphere, and it gets hard to separate fact from fiction.
And in this case, where it all came down to believing the brothers about the abuse, that media frenzy had to make things even more complicated.
For sure. The constant cameras analyzing every word, every gesture, digging into their personal lives. It's hard to imagine how they could have gotten a fair trial with all that noise.
So even though there was a guilty verdict, you have to wonder, was justice really served? Or did the media circus play a role in how it all ended?
That's a tough one. There's no easy answer there.
And that's what makes this case so fascinating, so thought-provoking. It's not just true crime. It's a reflection of us, our society, our values, our biases, and how we try to make sense of things, even when they're really messed up.
Totally agree. And it's a reminder that even decades later, the Menendez brothers, their case, it still matters. It raises questions about justice, abuse, family, and the power of the media.
Well said. And on that note, let's take a sec to appreciate something pretty awesome. You guys sent us a ton of material for this. Deep dive articles, trial transcripts, pop culture stuff, the whole shebang. It's clear you're really into this case, and that dedication to understanding it, that's impressive.
Absolutely. It's inspiring to see someone so committed to getting to the bottom of something like this. And I hope our conversation has given you some new angles to consider, some things to think about as you keep digging into this story.
For sure. And for everyone listening, we definitely encourage you to keep going with your own deep dive into this case. Do your own research, look at the evidence, consider different points of view, and come to your own conclusions.
Because, like we've seen, this case doesn't have easy answers. And it really pushes us to think about what justice is, what abuse is, and what it means to be human.
And that's what makes it so captivating. All right, that wraps up our deep dive into the Menendez brothers case for today. Thanks for joining us on this journey. And we'll catch you next time for another exploration of a topic guaranteed to get those brain cells firing. You know, it's crazy how even with the guilty verdict, even after all these years, people are still debating this case.
Yeah, it's like this case just won't let go.
Right. And there's this whole online world of, like, Menendez brothers truthers.
Truthers.
Yeah. People analyzing every single detail, trying to prove the brothers were wrongly convicted.
It shows you how powerful this story is, I think it speaks to this human need we all have to find answers, to make sense of things that seem, well, senseless.
You want resolution, closure.
Exactly. And sometimes even a guilty verdict, it doesn't quite do it for us,
Especially in a case like this. So much emotion, abuse, family secrets, wealth, privilege. It's all there.
It's a recipe for obsession, for sure.
Totally. But it's interesting how these online communities, their focus has kind of shifted over time.
Oh, yeah. How so?
It's less about proving the brothers didn't actually kill their parents and more about arguing that they were victims, driven to do something desperate.
That's really interesting. And, it kind of reflects this bigger change in how we as a society think about and talk about abuse.
Yeah, we're more aware of trauma now, right?
Definitely. We understand the long-term effects better, how victims might act in ways that don't make sense at first, and how hard it is to prove abuse, especially when it happens behind closed doors.
So these online communities, it's like they're holding up a mirror to how our understanding of these issues is changing.
I like that, the mirror analogy.
But it's not just about abuse, right? There's also this element of questioning the justice system itself.
Oh, for sure. A lot of these truthers, they say the brothers didn't get a fair trial, that the media frenzy biased the jury, and that the prosecution, well, they twisted things to fit their story.
Which brings us back to that media circus we talked about.
Yep, full circle.
This case was a turning point for how trials were covered. And it made people ask, can the media actually mess with someone's right to a fair trial?
Big questions. And I think the Menendez brothers case, it became this cautionary tale.
Oh, warning.
Yeah, about the need for responsible reporting, for impartial jurors, and how we balance the public's right to know with the defendant's right to a fair trial.
It's a reminder that justice, it's not just about finding out what happened. It's about making sure the process itself is fair, unbiased.
Couldn't agree more.
And that's a conversation we're still having today, right? With every big case that grabs everyone's attention.
Absolutely. And it makes you think, what's our responsibility as, just people consuming all this information?
Yeah, to be critical, not just believe everything we hear.
To question things, not rush to judgment.
Exactly. Because in a case like this, with all the layers, the different sides, and how it changed how we think about abuse and justice, there are no easy answers.
Nope. No simple conclusions.
And that's maybe the biggest thing to take away from all this. This case, it's messy, it's thought-provoking, it makes you uncomfortable.
It sticks with you.
And in a world that's always pushing simple answers, that complexity, it's valuable.
Absolutely. The Menendez brothers, their story, it stays with you, it makes you question, it challenges you, it's unsettling.
And it reminds us that truth, it's usually messy, nuanced, hard to pin down.
It's like trying to catch smoke.
And that getting to justice, it takes more than just a verdict. It takes a constant conversation, an evolving conversation about our values, our systems, and what it means to be human.
Beautifully said.
So, for anyone listening who wants to keep digging into this case, I say go for it. Dive into those online communities, read the trial transcripts, look at the evidence, and make up your own mind.
I second that. There's so much to discover, so many different perspectives.
Because this case, it doesn't belong to just the brothers or their parents or the courts.
It belongs to all of us, in a way.
It's a story about true crime, sure, but also about how our understanding of abuse has changed and how we're still figuring out this whole justice thing.
We're all works in progress.
Totally. And as we keep grappling with these big, messy issues, the Menendez brothers case, it'll always be there.
A reminder.
A source of debate. A case that shows us even the simplest stories can have hidden depths, uncomfortable truths.
And that's what makes it so fascinating.
Well said. And on that note, we're wrapping up our deep dive into the Menendez brothers case. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another episode that'll get you thinking.